Genghis Khan remains one of the most feared figures in all of human history. His name alone carries an almost mythical weight, a man who rose from the steppes of Mongolia to build an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the edge of Europe. His armies swept across Asia with unmatched speed and ferocity, leaving behind a trail of devastation that reshaped civilizations forever. But behind the stories of conquest, strategy, and empire, there are darker tales, ones filled with horror, brutality, and the suffering of women who became the silent victims of his legacy. Chroniclers, both during his lifetime and long after, painted a picture of not just a brilliant warlord, but of a man whose rise was drenched in blood and human misery. Women, in particular, became the most vulnerable targets of Mongol conquest. They were seen as both spoils of war and instruments of humiliation, forced into lives of degradation and violence. Yet, as with much of medieval history, we must question how much is fact and how much has been twisted into legend by his enemies. To begin to understand this, we have to step back into the world of the Mongol invasions. In the early 13th century, Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes of Mongolia into a disciplined and terrifying war machine. His army was fast, ruthless, and utterly loyal. Villages and cities that resisted often faced annihilation, their people massacred in full view of survivors, a deliberate act meant to instill terror. Before the next battle, those who submitted were sometimes spared, but submission rarely meant safety, especially for women. Accounts from Persian, Chinese, and European sources describe a grim pattern. After a Mongol victory, women were separated from men. Many were enslaved, taken as concubines, or forced into marriages designed to reward soldiers and officers. Others were paraded before the conquerors, stripped of dignity in public humiliations that served as warnings to any who dared resist Mongol rule. The chronicles speak of forced sexual servitude, women traded like property, and the deliberate use of sexual violence as a weapon of conquest. This tactic was not unique to the Mongols. Throughout history, from the Romans to the Vikings, conquering armies used sexual violence as both a psychological tool and a brutal assertion of dominance. But in the case of Genghis Khan, the scale was staggering. With each conquest, thousands of women were uprooted from their homes, their fates decided by the men who destroyed their cities. Some chronicles even go as far as to claim that Genghis Khan himself took countless wives and concubines, fathering children across vast regions. Modern genetic studies suggest that a significant portion of men in Central Asia share DNA link to him, a biological shadow of these dark practices. One of the most infamous accusations comes from Persian chroniclers, who wrote after the Mongols devastated Khwarezm, a wealthy empire stretching across Persia and Central Asia. Cities such as Nishapur, Urgent, and Samarkand were obliterated. Survivors described not only mass slaughter, but also systematic humiliation of women. Wives and daughters of nobles were taken as trophies, often forced into degrading positions to display the conqueror's absolute control. These accounts, dripping with horror, were intended to cement Genghis Khan's image as a figure of fear and inhuman cruelty. Yet, it is also here that historians must tread carefully. Many of these stories come from enemy sources, writers whose lands have been burned, whose people massacred, and whose hatred of the Mongols colored their pens with rage. Was every tale of atrocity true, or were some exaggerated to cast Genghis Khan as the very embodiment of evil? The truth may lie somewhere in between. While propaganda certainly played a role, the suffering of women under Mongol rule cannot be dismissed as fabrication. Too many sources, from too many regions, echo the same grim chorus of sexual violence, forced marriages, and the destruction of family bonds. What makes these accounts even more chilling is the cold pragmatism with which Genghis Khan approached human lives. For him, women were not just victims of conquest, but tools of empire building. By marrying daughters of conquered rulers to his generals, or taking noble women into his own family, He reinforced alliances and ensured loyalty. For common women, their value was reduced to that of reward, distributed to warriors to maintain morale and bind them to his cause. In this way, sexual violence was institutionalized, not random acts of cruelty, but a structured part of conquest. Imagine the terror of a woman in a besieged city. Hearing the thunder of hooves and the shouts of Mongol warriors, she would know the fate awaiting her, the collapse of her world, the slaughter of her family, and the inevitable stripping away of her humanity. These were not isolated incidents but repeated tragedies, enacted again and again as the Mongol armies moved westward. Even European sources, though often relying on hearsay, echoed the tales of Mongol brutality. When word of the Mongols reached Hungary, Poland, and beyond, rumors of unimaginable cruelty spread like wildfire. Priests and chroniclers warned that the Mongols not only killed without mercy, but also enslaved women, degrading them in ways too shameful to describe in detail. Such rumors, whether entirely accurate or exaggerated, achieved their purpose. They fueled fear, painting the Mongols as a horde of demons unleashed upon Christendom. Yet in the midst of this terror, there is also a strange contradiction. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, was said to impose strict rules on the conduct of his people. Some accounts claim it forbade the kidnapping of women without permission, or punished certain sexual crimes. If these laws truly existed, they highlight the vast gulf between Mongol ideals on paper and the brutal reality of conquest on the ground. For women captured in war, no law could shield them from the immediate violence of soldiers or the long-lasting suffering of forced servitude. The shadow of these atrocities lingers to this day. While some remember Genghis Khan as a unifier, a lawgiver, and even a visionary leader who opened trade routes and fostered cultural exchange, others cannot separate his name from the violence inflicted upon the most vulnerable. The blood of the conquered and the tears of countless women are part of his legacy as much as the empire he built. Part 1 ends here, with the image of Genghis Khan not just as a conqueror of cities, but as a conqueror of lives, leaving scars that transcended generations. The terror associated with Genghis Khan did not end with his death in 1227. For centuries afterward, stories of his brutality, especially the suffering of women, spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. In some regions, mothers frightened children into obedience by whispering his name, while monks recorded visions of him as a demon scourge sent by God as punishment for human sins. His shadow grew larger than life, an embodiment of destruction itself. But as with all figures of history, the truth is more complex than a single narrative of cruelty. Some modern historians argued that many of the most graphic accounts of sexual violence and torture were magnified by his enemies. Persians, Chinese dynasties, and Christian Europeans had every reason to demonize the Mongols, casting Genghis Khan as a monster who reveled in humiliation and depravity. These stories were weapons of words, meant to preserve dignity for the conquered by painting their destroyer as a beast beyond humanity. Yet, dismissing these accounts entirely risks erasing the lived reality of women who endured conquest. The Mongol Empire's expansion was built upon submission, and submission was not only enforced on the battlefield but also within homes, families, and bodies. For noble women, survival often meant becoming part of the Mongol political machine, tied in forced marriages to generals or even to Genghis Khan himself. For common women, survival meant slavery, servitude, or degradation, with little hope of escape. One of the most striking aspects of this period is the duality of the Mongol reputation. On one hand, their empire brought unprecedented connectivity to the medieval world, opening up the Silk Road, fostering trade, and allowing ideas, goods, and even technologies to flow from China to Europe. On the other, this global network was built on rivers of blood and the silenced cries of the vulnerable. For every merchant who benefited from Mongol protection, countless women were dragged into darkness, their voices erased by history. The legend of Genghis Khan's personal life adds another disturbing layer. It is said that he fathered hundreds, perhaps thousands, of children, with his lineage spreading across much of Eurasia. Genetic studies suggest that around 16 million men alive today may carry a Y chromosome linked back to a single man from that era, widely believed to be Genghis Khan. While some portray this as a mark of his virility, it is also a stark reminder of what that number truly represents, not romance or love, but conquest and coercion, women used as vessels in the expansion of empire. The question remains, was Genghis Khan truly the monster described in chronicles, or was he the victim of propaganda that exaggerated his brutality? The answer may lie in accepting both. He was undoubtedly a military genius, a leader who transformed scattered tribes into an unstoppable empire. But genius does not erase cruelty for those who faced his armies, especially the women who bore the brunt of conquest. There is no doubt that terror was real. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories of humiliation, forced marriages, and sexual violence remain essential to understanding the cost of his empire. The suffering inflicted upon women during this time highlights a broader truth about history. War rarely spares the vulnerable. Women often become symbols, tools, and casualties. Their experience is written only in whispers, while the names of conquerors thunder across the ages. Genghis Khan may be remembered as a unifier, but for many, he was the destroyer of lives, leaving behind not just an empire, but scars etched deep into human memory. Today, debates continue about how Genghis Khan should be remembered. In Mongolia, he is revered as a national hero, his image adorning currency and monuments. Across Central Asia and even parts of Europe, his name still evokes dread. The contrast reflects the complexity of history itself, a man celebrated for unity, feared for cruelty, and remembered for the shadows his armies cast across entire continents. When we speak of Genghis Khan's darkest secrets, the torture, the sexual violence, the degradation of women, we confront the uncomfortable reality of how power was maintained in the medieval world. Fear was his greatest weapon, and suffering was part of the architecture of empire. The stories may blur fact and myth, but their persistence proves how deeply they resonated with those who lived through Mongol terror. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. Even if some details were exaggerated, they carried a ring of possibility that made them believable. Because in times of war, human cruelty so often exceeds imagination. If you've made it this far, you can see that history is not only about dates and battles, but about the lives crushed under the weight of empire. Genghis Khan's empire may have changed the world, but it came at a cost written in suffering and silence. If you're fascinated by these dark truths of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story from humanity's darkest chapters. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Genghis Khan was more myth than monster, or was his cruelty as real as the chronicles describe? Because in the end, history is not only about the conquerors we remember, but also about the victims we must never forget.